Sorry, what's that?
Are you spotlighting?
I can. I won't do that right now, but I'll do it in a moment. So let's start with an acknowledgement of country. We acknowledge and pay our respects to elders past and present on all the lands in Australia that our meeting participants presently occupy. We also welcome the lessons we can learn from Indigenous spirituality, connection to the land, and creation generally. Let's start with an opening prayer. Start with a moment of centering. Use this time to focus on your breathing. Use a familiar meditation practice, or bring your focus to the great Creator Spirit, whom I choose to call God. We thank God for the gift of breath and welcome the opportunity to explore the mystery of creation and of our lives on earth. So it's been some time since we talked about the name of this series of meetings. We have many new faces and they've joined us over the past 6 to 12 months. So here's a brief explanation. We regard an individual's spiritual journey as a lifelong experience of learning and transition. We've termed our meeting and our discussion papers as the Butterfly Series. A caterpillar enters a cocoon and undergoes an incubation period of transformation, emerging eventually as a butterfly. In a similar way, the spiritual seeker undergoes an incubation period of questioning, research, reading and conversation, emerging eventually with a transformed worldview. The butterfly represents for us an appropriate metaphor for the transition that a seeker on a spiritual journey will experience from time to time. So as far as the plan for this meeting is concerned, the paper was prepared by Kevin Liston. In this meeting, Robert Van Murick will interview Kevin about the paper. During the meeting, I invite you to comment or ask questions by using the chat room. I will monitor this feed and introduce your input as appropriate. There'll be a short period for audience questions and comment, which may include visiting the reflection questions at the end of the paper. We'll finish with a 3-minute silent reflection period and a wrap-up. And just in case you didn't know, this meeting is being recorded. The Zoom protocols remain muted to avoid background noise, please. And during the Q&A session, if you wish to comment or ask a question, could you please use the hands up tool in your toolbar? I can hear someone in the background there, so just if there's a sound going, please alter that. I'll just highlight Kevin. And I'll also spotlight Robert. So just to introduce Kevin, Kevin is a co-chair of the Council of Australasian Catholics, formerly what was known as the Australian Catholic Coalition for Church Reform. He's a convener of the South Australian Catholics for an Evolving Church, a state council member of St Vincent de Paul, South Australia, and active in the local Vinnies Conference. Following his retirement, he completed a Master of Theological Studies at ACU and a graduate diploma in psychology at Monash University. So welcome, Kevin, and thanks very much for your paper. I'll now hand over to Robert to conduct the interview.
Thanks, John. Thank you, Kevin.
You're welcome, and it's good to be here.
I have to say, Kevin, I've been looking forward to this. It's
good.
We usually hear small contributions from you during our meetings. It's going to be good to hear you in an expanded format. Besides, we get to listen to your Irish brogue.
I hope you can
Good.
understand it.
Oh, we manage. We manage. It's very pleasant.
Good.
So your paper's very interesting and it's very comprehensive. But perhaps we could start by helping us understand by who was Bernard Lonergan?
Bernard Lonergan was a Jesuit priest. He lived from 1904 to 1984. So a lot of his life was spent in time before Vatican II, which is when he did a lot of his creative thinking. He was teaching at the Gregorian University in Rome at the time of Vatican II, but he never really received much publicity at that time, although he was involved in advising people at the council. But the major discovery I think that Lonergan made was in realizing that our minds are active, that we are agents in our own minds, in our own thinking, and that consciousness is something, it's a question of being aware of what's happening. Lots of people speak about consciousness as knowing and I find it, seem to bring the two together as consciousness as being a kind of knowing. But consciousness in Lonergan's world is being aware of what's happening. And what's happening is that you're noticing stuff. You're paying attention. There's you're hearing, seeing, tasting, touching, feeling, and not just the physical element of those things, but there's something happening inside and you're able to form images with your imagination. And then you ask yourself, well, what does this mean? What does it make sense of? How do you make sense of it? And that's where insight comes in. And we often talk about people who don't have any insight. They don't understand. And gaining an insight is like, what's the word for it? You get loads and loads of insights. I forget, there's all kinds of insights might occur to you when an issue arises or a problem. That's the example that I have given is somebody turns up at the doctor and they've got a pain. And the doctor, speculates initially as to it could be, due to a broken bone, or it could be due to an infection, or it could be something else, and then does a bit more examination and so on and finds out just what it is. And at that stage, the doctor can say that he knows. He hasn't just got an idea, but he knows that this particular idea is correct. But we're not just thinking people or knowing people. We also decide. We do things. We want to know what can we do with what we've learned. We evaluate situations. We say, well, what's worthwhile doing and what's not worthwhile, and then make a decision on it. And it's that process from imagination to decision is something that happens in everybody. It's not what you might call a method that you would apply. It's more than that. It's what you're actually doing already, even if you're unaware of the fact that you might be doing it. Because we all make decisions. And one of the points I would like to make about Lonergan is that he discovered this basically from Aquinas. Now, Aquinas tends to get a bad press these days for stuff that he didn't know. But then he lived in the 1200s, and there was an awful lot of stuff he didn't know because nobody knew. And there's also an issue there in that after Aquinas, a lot of people half read his stuff and thought they knew what he was saying, but they didn't. And that's where Lonergan comes into his own, in that he went behind it and studied it and worked out this business of where does our thinking come from? It comes from ourselves. It's not a mystery, but it's something we all do, but we don't advert to it most of the time. I would say, I know you, Robert. But I could also say I'm conscious of you. They're very different things. Like in the sense that being conscious of something is being aware of it. But knowing means understanding, means having a sense of who you are and what you're about, what are your values, and so on. So that it's that movement into an awareness of what we're doing as agents that is important, and that we are agents. We're not just pushed around by the world.
Very
Does
good.
that make sense?
Well, that's a very long introduction to Bernard Lonergan.
Sorry if it's too long. You should interrupt me.
No, I don't want to do that. So why do you think this topic is important, Kevin? Or perhaps I
Because
can help you there.
that's the reality of who we are and what we are. People very often think of the workings of the mind as mysterious, as unknown, as something that we just can't go near. In fact, it's there for any one of us to explore it and to be aware of it. And that's why it's important, because that's who we are in ourselves. Yeah. And again, it's that if you know where you are or how you operate, that's the word I would guess is to put on it. Then, and nobody else can do that for you. So that you become then the sole, well, you are anyway, the sole agent of who you are when you're doing that. Now, if you allow somebody else to tell you what you should be doing when you're thinking, then you've missed something. You've turned aside from your own self to somebody else. And that's where it's important. And your, how do I put it? If you're not conscious of what you're doing, when you're thinking, when you're knowing and deciding, then you have a stunted sense of who you are as an agent. Now, we're familiar, I guess, with that kind of neo-scholasticism that prevailed, and it prevailed hugely before Vatican II, but it still continues in many ways, which is emphasizing the objective, the what's out there, to the extent that the individual as an agent themselves gets lost and doesn't receive the kind of attention that the agent gets. Now, there has been a turn since the mid last century towards a much more personalist sense of who we are. Previous to that, it was very much the community. But people have been moving to a much more individuated sense, and in Carol Jung's terms, it's individuated. It's not individualism, but it's recognizing your own agency. And that is what will save people and save the world, when people take responsibility for that. That's why it's important.
Thank you. You're touching on a couple of points there, Kevin.
Yes.
On the homepage of our website, we have an article that discusses the importance of the importance of consciousness in spirituality. And that article describes various levels of consciousness and postulates that in order to grow spiritually, we need to grow through these levels of consciousness. And the article also reports a comment that Albert Einstein is supposed to have made, where he said that the problems of the world can only be solved by a level of consciousness that is higher than the level of consciousness that created it or created them. And so 2/3 of the world is reputed to exist at the first and second of 5 levels of consciousness. Do you agree with Einstein that we all need to grow into higher levels of consciousness to help solve the problems of the world?
If you see consciousness as being knowing, I agree with him completely. But I think it's like using the word consciousness in that situation, it makes it difficult to differentiate stages in that, like levels. Whereas if you think of it, think of Einstein's position as saying, a problem that's caused by a certain level of knowledge about the issues will not be solved on that level. It will be solved by understanding the issues more clearly, more comprehensively, and more contextually. And I think that's what he's getting at, but he doesn't use the word knowing. Like, for example, somebody has a sore knee and it's really bothering them, and they don't know what causes it, or what they can do about it. They might try putting on some rubs on it, or massage it, or do some exercises or whatever. But it's very much working in the dark, and they still have a problem with their knee. And what to do about it? They go to the doctor, and if he's a good doctor, he'll do some examination, he'll work on it, and he'll realize what the issue is, what the problem is, because he knows an awful lot more about how knees work. He has actually studied his stuff, so that it's the greater knowledge that enables the solution to be found. And we can see that happening all around us. That's why we have, say, like professional auditors or professional psychologists or whatever. They're people who have that extra knowledge. And Einstein himself, obviously, developed during his life. So the questions that he had earlier in life, he was able to solve later on, or answer later on, because he acquired a lot more knowledge. He understood it better. He learned about what was happening.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about consciousness as a contrast to unconscious behavior.
Yes.
I'm reminded of my experience as a new parent. My kids are now 30 years old, so this is a long time ago. And when they were toddlers, my wife and I were unhappy about the way things were going in our family. So we took ourselves off to parenting course at university. And I like to think that my children are going to be better at being parents than I was at the time. But I realized that the impetus for going to that course was the realization that my responses to many situations were unconscious. They were reflexive responses based on how my parents treated me when I was a child. And when I had the opportunity to realize that and reflect upon it, I decided I'd do something different. Maybe not to the good. But Anthony de Mello, another Jesuit, wrote a book about this sort of thing called awareness. This would go back into the early 80s. There was a recording of the seminar that he'd given. But he gave the example of having a leprechaun sitting on your shoulder, listening to everything you're saying. And the leprechaun would ask you, where did that come from? Why did you say that? And so when you answer that question, you realize, oh, that wasn't me. That was what my father used to say. And then you get to challenge a lot of your unconscious thinking. And then that moves one towards a more conscious approach to your own behavior. And you call the book awareness. And the people in the seminar asked him, what does awareness mean? And he said, awareness means awareness, awareness, awareness. Are there similarities between what de Mello was saying and what you're saying that de Mello, Lonergan is pointing towards?
I think you've just given a very good example of what Lonergan is talking about. In terms of your own, like, initially you weren't happy with the situation that you had. You decided to go to a parenting course where you learned. You had some insights into your own behavior. You understood what was going on. And you were able to work out, yep, this is what's happening. And you decided to do something about it. And what I'm getting at is what the process that you were going through in your own mind, rather than thinking about what's happening with the child. It's that internal stuff. So that what you've described is that it's consciousness in action, I guess. But because we can use the various terms for various stages of what you're doing, it becomes much more understandable or much more graspable. You can talk about it, you can explain it, rather than just saying a level of consciousness and another level of consciousness. It is that that you know more. And the leprechaun on your shoulder, asking where did that come from? That's your own internal questioning. And you're asking yourself. It's all a process that's going on all the time, and you're doing it. And so you're not just a consciousness that's happening. Your agency is happening in that. You're making it happen. Does that make sense?
Oh, it does. And I'll give you your $10 later. You've
Sorry?
been very complimentary. You've been very complimentary. I'll pay you later.
Okay. Yeah. So, yeah.
Okay. Well, then, does one's worldview come into that sort of analysis? The reason I ask that is that in this article, the levels of consciousness are described as at the lowest level being very egocentric, which means it's all about me. The second level is ethnocentric. It's all about my town, my football team, perhaps my country. And that's where 2/3 of the world exists. But when you take that to the highest level, the level that Einstein was talking about, and this is where we go with quantum physics, Einstein's pointing to a world where we are all connected with everyone, everything, everywhere, even throughout time. So if we look at some current behaviours of world politicians, we can see that they're operating at very egocentric or ethnocentric levels. They don't see this interconnectedness with people on the other side. And if they could recognise that the commonalities that they have, well, then maybe they would modify their behaviours. Does that introduce another dimension to consciousness?
I think you're spot on. And as we grow, we learn until we get to a stage, a kind of plateau in our development, in our growth, where we feel just comfortable with it. And we are drawn between the comfort that we've got with the position we're in, and the difficulty of actually moving on to anything else in terms of learning about the world, for instance. And it's not just learning about the world in terms of knowing what the world is, but it also means adapting to a much broader world view. But like, you have to be conscious in order to do this, but it's what you're doing while you're conscious is the point I would make, in that it is that doing while you're conscious that takes you through the process of learning from the narrow childhood, home and mom and dad view of the world onto a much bigger world as you go through school. And, you have more experience in dealing with people all over, and you learn a lot more about a bigger world. And some people retain a very narrow view of what life is all about. Other people can be much more expansive, and there's a whole lot of mental health diagnoses that will refer to that as well, as part of that. To pick an example out of the blue, our friend in Washington, has a very particular worldview, which is very focused on himself. And that's where he is. Whereas if you take somebody else who, I don't know, who would you pick? The Dalai Lama maybe, or Pope Leo, or someone who sees the world in a very different way. But it's all due to how they understand it, how they learned about it, and the choices they have made on that. So it's a whole combination of things that enable people to grow. So yeah,
Yes,
yes, there are those, ethnocentric and yeah.
Well, I think there are examples of Pope John, who someone had a shot at him and tried to kill him.
Yeah.
And there is that image of him sitting in the prison cell with his assailant. And a lot of people would have looked at that and said, how could he have done that?
Yeah.
How could he sit in the same room? And that's not the only example of this sort of behaviour, but they're numerous when you look around. But it's only possible if he could look at his assailant as someone like himself with much more in common than their differences.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So that takes us to looking at Lonergan in how can we use his methodology, his method, to enhance our own spiritual growth?
By becoming aware of it, by knowing it. And in a way, I might go back to your bit about John Paul and the prisoner, that it requires a certain kind of conversion of mind and attitude and perception to be able to do something like that. To be able to love other people, openly and freely, is a kind of conversion. But it's a normal human element in life that people can cultivate it. Now, you can make that kind of thing just happen, but you can create all the conditions that enable it to happen, so that you get to the point where, yes, suddenly you wake up. It's a bit like falling in love. We think generally of falling in love as something that happens to us. But in order for it to happen, we have to be open to the possibility that it might happen. And if we're not open to that possibility, then it's not likely to happen. Now, of course, there are people who will say they're not open to it when in fact they are, but don't know themselves very well. And most of us don't know ourselves very well. I'm still learning basic stuff about myself. Yeah.
I'm reminded 40 years ago, I read a series of books called A Course in Miracles. And one of those books had a saying for every day of the year. And one of those sayings was, I am never angry for the reason I think.
Goodbye. Yes.
I have carried that with me for decades. and I reflect on it from time to time. I had an instance this morning where we had a disagreement with the supplier of a cooktop to our house, and we bought it subject to certain conditions of precedent. If you tick these boxes, we'll buy the cooktop.
Yeah.
Well, the conditions weren't met. We let the retailer know that it wasn't satisfactory. They could have the cooktop back, and we wanted our money back. So then the manufacturer of the cooktop sent me a message saying, yeah, we'll do all of this and we'll take 20% off for a restocking fee. And I'm usually a pretty calm person, but I was not when I got that text. That's all getting sorted out now. But some people might think all this sounds very good in theory. Let's see if we can apply it to a practical example. Let's pick an easy one.
Yeah.
How might we develop a higher consciousness view of something like multiculturalism, or alternatively monoculturalism? No names, no factual. We're just looking at the culturalisms.
Yeah. I think we've also got to be aware of the fact, like there's if you like, the objective side of everything that we know is the what we know is there, and there's that reality of the things that we do know. And then there's the side of the subject, the individual, the agent, who is doing the knowing. And I would say that Lonergan's system is applicable in both. But in the case of the person doing the knowing, it's not a theory. It's not just a way of manipulating or dealing with the world. It's the way, in fact, we do deal with the world. So in a sense, there's no revelation in that. But it's a case of adverting to it. Like, whereas when you're dealing with the people at the cooktop, you're going through a system that actually mirrors what you're going through in terms of how you behave as a human. This is the way humans do things. They get an experience, they have an imagination, they are image, they understand then what this thing means. And you understood, very well, what your cooktop was intended to do and what it didn't do. And you decided on what you were going to do about it. And that's where you're making yourself, which is the important part in terms of the spirituality. That is you becoming, because if you're the kind of person who said, well, yeah, the cooktop doesn't work, but I'm not going to worry about that. And you just, put it aside and put it out in the rubbish sometime and go and buy another one and just calmly accept that. That's the difference between you as a proactive individual and someone else as a passive person. And that's where you're making yourself. And that's where the importance of it is, I think. And when you apply that to monoculturalism or multiculturalism, the question is, what position are you coming from yourself? How well do you understand what multiculturalism is against what monoculturalism is? And which one would you value? And why would you value it one more than the other? And that's the kind of person that's you making yourself in that. Somebody else might say, oh, monoculturalism, I don't understand all of that and I'm not going to bother with it. So they don't have a position. They don't become that kind of person, who follows it through. And if you get yourself, say, a political campaign happens to come up, the person who understands, who has practiced examining and questioning and finding the answers to those issues, it's far better able to vote properly or vote intelligently than the other. I get, now the fact is that most people can go through life without reflecting on this, and they manage life very well indeed. And that's okay. But if you want to be more than just sailing through life, and if you like, you're just sailing along on the surface, then you start examining yourself. Well, what are your motives? Why do you do this? And you can go from, where the experiences came from, as in what your father told you, or your parents said about how you should treat a child, and work through, the knowledge of it, understanding it, and making your decisions. But I'd like to add, if I might, an element here, that this activity that you're doing is spiritual. It's not just material. That's your spiritual life doing that. That's what spirituality comes from. Your spirituality is the result of you being responsible, you being intelligent, being reasonable, practicing that. And the more you're aware of how you do that, then the better you're able to be, you are at managing it. First, on the spiritual side of it, like that is what being spiritual is, and that's our spiritual selves is in doing that. It's not in some vague, unknown mystery. In the past, it was a mystery because we didn't understand how our minds work, or how we work our minds, how we work mentally. We didn't understand that. So spiritual activity was a mystery. But now it doesn't have to be. You can actually work out how you do it if you pay attention to it. And if you look for the insights in how it happens, and you're responsible then in terms of how you act after doing that. There's another point that I'd like to make also, and it's hugely overlooked these days, is the difference between the mind and the brain. They're not the same thing. But so many people would say, like just quite casually, my brain told me this, or my brain did that, or whatever. Now, that's okay in just chit-chat and conversation. But your brain doesn't actually have thoughts. That's your mind. You need your brain in order to be able to think. And if your brain is damaged, then you can't. But thinking is not the same as nerves interacting in that stuff that's in your head. It's different. You move to a different level of reality, or a level of living. In the same way that, all the biology that applies to animals applies to humans. But we've got more. There's more to humans. There's something else going on. Their brains have developed into a complexity whereby thinking is actually possible. Now, it gets a little bit confusing because, in the sense that some of the higher animals are able to do what looks like very basic thinking, like chimpanzees and apes and animals like that. They can do what amounts to very, very basic thinking. But then, of course, we know now that, well, we're descended from them anyway. So it's only natural that somehow, there wasn't someday when some Neanderthal or Homo sapiens woke up and said, I'm a human, I'm not an animal anymore. It took millions of years for that to happen.
So, Kevin,
And it's still happening.
now that you've mentioned apes and Neanderthals, it's time for me to introduce a question. Lisa asks, this paper is terrific encouragement to trust our innermost being. What happens if we only serve our inner selves and fail to discern a divine identity or greater purpose to pursue? What draws Lonergan's model forward?
It's open. It's asking questions, and questions never stop. It's open-ended. And if you ask yourself, well, I've grown from being a wee child, and I've learned a lot. And lots of other people around me have developed in all kinds of ways, and scientists are busy trying to discover all sorts of stuff. There's no end sight in that. And it asks the question, well, what's the origin of all this? Like everything that we know has a cause. Yeah? And it's popular these days to debunk that first cause thing. But in fact, like everything that we know of has a cause. So what caused us? And what are we reaching out to in terms of reaching for a fuller life? It doesn't make any sense to me that we spend our whole lives trying to develop ourselves into being all that we can be, or the scientists spend their lives researching in the huge organizations working on it, and then suddenly at death it just drops out, falls away. That's the end of it. Poof, you're gone. That doesn't make sense to me. That somehow there's more to life than human living. Now, don't ask me what it is. I don't know. But I'm a very firm believer that there is. Yeah. Now, I can't convince anybody against their will or whatever, about that. So it becomes personal, and you have to ask yourself, where do you stand on that? And everybody has to ask that question and answer it for themselves. And again, that's where I think Lonergan's emphasis on being responsible, of thinking through stuff yourself, and of taking agency yourself for the kind of person that you are. The buck stops with you.
Kevin, one of the
And
things that I was thinking about as I read your paper was probably falls into the understanding step. When you're sitting around a table with 5 or 6 other people at a meeting, you can just about guarantee that each of those individuals will have a different set of facts in their mind.
yes,
And they come to the meeting potentially with different values.
yes.
How does Lonergan's understanding section deal with that issue? That issue of coming to a discussion with different facts and different values.
Hugely, we come to with different values, different a sense of what reality is, because each one of us has been through our own unique process of understanding, of learning, of developing, of growing. Now, in a sense, like back where I grew up in the south of Ireland, there was I had far less scope for a breadth of understandings or knowledge or whatever, and people had a fairly narrow culture, if you like, or life, or there was a lot of shared meanings in that sense, and there was a lot of conformity and so on there. Now, people come together, and if they're having a meeting, they've got a common purpose of some kind. That's what brings them together. And that's why they're there. And that common purpose is, I guess, the glue, if you like, that holds that together. But they do all have their own individual values, knowledge, worldview, outlook, and so on. Now, that's inevitable. But we also all can agree on, well, not all, but we do agree on certain values that we see as important. And in a place like Australia, we're very fortunate in that there's a huge lot of social values and cultural values that we're quite happy to agree with. And we'll go along and we'll be polite to one another. And we'll stick to the rules of the road, for instance. And we won't start throwing rubbish over the neighbor's fence. And we'll accept all of those things. There's a huge amount that is accepted. But when it falls apart, as in time of war, for instance, then there's all kinds of suspicions and so on going on. People become very nervous because they don't have that common sense. I think it's exemplified, say, I think there was a real increase in anti-Semitism and anti-Islamophobia going on because of events that have happened and have affected people's thinking and attitudes and so on.
All right.
And
well, thank you, Kevin. I might just let people know that we're into the general Q&A question. Robert, you've got your hand up. What's your comment or question?
I was going to make a comment because I'm conscious that you've got your eye on the clock. I think we're understanding, as a result of what Kevin's talking about, the importance of all of us accepting our own responsibility to grow spiritually. You might wonder, if I can do this for myself, so what? Am I going to make a difference in the world? And I want to share with you something that John and I agreed upon a long time ago when we were getting St. Lucia's spirituality going. And that's a concept that was pioneered by a biologist, Dr. Rupert Sheldrake in England. And he observed that crows, for example, crows might learn how to open a rubbish bin to get their food, or bin chickens here in Australia. And then their offspring could mimic that behaviour. But not only did that happen, crows on the other side of the country also started mimicking that behaviour without being consciously aware of what the birds on the other side of the country were doing. And this can even extend across the world. And the term he gave to this was a morphic or a morphogenic field, where knowledge is transmitted across large distances, across time, in a way that we don't fully understand, but it does happen. And the point of all of that is that as we change personally, our changes impact other people in other places in a similar way. So while we all do our little bit to improve ourselves, we are all also improving the world. And that's a belief that John and I persist with in the work that we do with St. Lucia's spirituality. So it's important to take notice of what Kevin's been saying and to apply that sort of knowledge to our own behaviours so that we can grow, so that, as Einstein said, we can solve the problems of the world that were created by people who existed at lower levels of thinking. Would you agree with that, Kevin?
Yes, I would. I guess two aspects to it. One is that we don't live isolated as monads or whatever. Like from the day we're born, we're into relationships of one kind or another, and we live by relationships. And most of the knowledge that's developed is developed in relationships. Whether it's scientists or whatever who are doing it, or ourselves in our own living, it's in the context of a relationship. So that I think that connection with other people is vitally important. That doesn't take away from the responsibility that I have for making sure that my end of the relationship is genuine and authentic. As regards the other thing with you described with the crows, I don't know how that works, and I wouldn't attempt to answer it. And nowhere have I seen any indication that Lonergan tries to answer that kind of a situation. And I'd say, well, it's one of those things that, we've got to leave something for the future scientists to find out, and the future people who are dealing with human psychology and human knowing and so on have got to work out. We don't have all the answers.
Well, Sheldrake only developed these theories in the 90s, and
Yeah.
Lonergan probably did not even know who he was.
Well, he died in 1984.
Can I,
He'd folded his tents up and gone.
can I invite Holly? Holly, earlier in the meeting, you had your hand up. Did you have a comment or question that you wanted to ask Kevin? You'll need to unmute.
Hi. Okay. I'm sort of worried because I've got two questions. One is, I encountered something by accident when I was only 9 years old. There was an offer of a free IQ test, which my older sisters thought was rather good, and we went to it, and we underwent it, and then they did a meeting, and they had also, it was an organization, and very little money involved, but you could have a free, help to be a better individual. It turned out that this was the very early beginnings of a movement that actually is very toxic. It's called the Scientology, and they've actually had the nerve to call themselves the Church of Scientology. And some people stupidly, believe that they're very absolutely against anything godly. But what they believe is they've taken the ideas that you find in the sort of Jewish mysticism and that of this idea of levels of consciousness, and they believe you can work through them, and then each time you pay a lot more money to get to the other stages. Fortunately, my mother realized what a hogwash it was, and we stopped having anything to do with them. But they go higher, and eventually, when you've paid a huge fortune, you can become a clear. And once you're a clear, your happiness, business success, good relationships, because you're thinking so clearly. And I hate to say it, it's very much it doesn't work at all. But going to the actual basis, the levels of consciousness, I would like to ask, this is something we do, we sort of have all those things. You're pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. And I would like to ask very deeply, what happens in this if we're trying to attain good rational thinking, which of course is vital? Has Einstein reached God before us? Do the quantum physicists, are they better equipped to know God? I look at, St. Patrick's breastplate, Christ be in me, Christ before me, Christ. It is with Jesus that we develop ourselves as people, and not a kind of it's wonderful to think, but there are certainly people with brain damaged children who will never have these wonderful levels, and yet God is there with them and relates to them. And surely isn't it all about Jesus that makes us the really deep thinking, caring person that we need to be? So I'm just a bit against the idea of self, boots putting yourself up, trying to think better. That's part of life, education. But you can't, remember the poem Invictus where it said,
Thanks, Holly. I'm going to ask Kevin if he understands your question. Kevin?
Yeah, I think I do. And I would say that it's very important that we use our bootstraps to pull ourselves up as well as we can, but we don't do it alone. We never do it alone. We do it with other people. And the question about the Scientology, I think it's important that you take note, as Robert was saying earlier on, of the leprechaun on your shoulder. Where did you get that? Where did it come from? How did you get to that experience? And what's the insight? Is it real? Is it true? Does it match your experience of other situations? Critical thinking, I think, is extremely important in that regard. And being responsible about how you live it and so on, does it actually, take away from your relationships with other people, or does it enhance it? And at a deep down level yourself, do you feel comfortable with it? Like that is very important. But I'd like to comment also, if I might, John, on that the relationship with Jesus.
Yep.
How do
Go
we
ahead.
relate to Jesus? Sorry?
Go ahead.
Yeah. How do we relate to Jesus? How do we make him present to us? We do it in terms of understanding the kind of man that he was. What were his values? What was his vision? How did he relate to other people around him? And it's when we understand those things, those elements of what he was about, then we're in a relationship with him. It's not like as if I have to imagine him standing there in front of me or beside me or whatever. That doesn't work like it doesn't work like that. It's that presence of appreciating who he is and the kind of man he is, so that his values, his way of thinking penetrates, I guess, my values, my way of thinking, and that's where it's important, I think, to know him.
All right.
And
Thank you,
that's
Kevin.
where we get in touch. Yeah.
The time is now 5 to, or almost 4 minutes to 6. So it's time for us to have a pause, take some time, some quiet time to reflect and to pray or journal if that's what you do. What was new or different or challenging for you tonight? What is God saying to you? What questions do you want to pursue or do more research on? We'll just have a short, quiet time, and I'll call you back shortly. All right. Well, this has been an interesting and challenging topic, I think. Hopefully, our discussion tonight has given you some insight into Bernard Lonergan and his approach to human consciousness and the structure that he proposes. A special thank you to Kevin for the discussion paper and to Robert for conducting the interview. Please keep spreading the word about St. Lucia spirituality. We are tapping into a true need in our community for discussions about spirituality. If you wish to suggest a topic or believe you have a discussion paper inside you, we would be happy to hear from you. Our next meeting will be on the 4th of August. We will examine how one's worldview is formed and how it influences one's behaviour. For the spiritual seeker, questions arise as to how conscious one is of their worldview and whether their worldview is altered as the spiritual journey matures. We hope you can join us for a discussion on this topic at that time. If you're with us for the first time tonight, I'd encourage you to subscribe to our monthly newsletter, which you can do at the bottom of the homepage on our website. This concludes the formal meeting. Have a wonderful week. As usual, I'll keep the meeting open for a further 15 minutes for those who wish to continue discussing this topic or any other topic. So thanks, folks.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Kevin.
You're welcome.
Kevin,
It's a
one
pleasure,
of
and
the
thank you for
things
the
I would
invitation.
comment on is about anger. Robert mentioned anger, and I certainly have to deal with anger quite a lot. And my reflection on anger is that that's unconscious behavior. When you get angry, you're responding to your own feelings without going through any process of decision making that is conscious.
Yeah. There's a guy, Robert Doran, who has developed, he's a huge fan of Lonergan, has written lots of stuff about him, but he has developed his own theory in addition to those 4 levels that Lonergan talks about: experience, understanding, judging, and deciding. That there's a psychic level that needs to be attended to, and that is as important as the rest of it. I think one of the best ways of getting into that sense of where does that come from is that in the course of a day, we're all subjected to a million experiences of, hot and cold, light, sounds all around us, people talking around us, people saying stuff that we just don't have time to process. We don't have the energy or the ability to process at all. Where does it go? Like, we do hear it, and I think it goes into a kind of a psyche place, in a sense, that emerges, so that there's a whole lot, like, say that the body knows more than we know.
All right, Margaret, you have your hand up.
Oh, thank you, John. Thanks, Kevin, and thank you, Robert. I'm currently reading Michael Pollan's book, A World Appears, A Journey into Consciousness, which is not written from any religious or spiritual perspective, but it's simply an inquiry about the concept of consciousness, which is helpful and interesting. And there are some questions and conversations about some of the things there, but I think I would be taking the airwaves far too long if I raise those in our minutes. But I do have this question, Kevin. If we are indeed, as we are, sentient beings with agency, and we can, in a sense, work out our own salvation, what place is there for a formal church structure apart from being a place where it's agreeable to meet with like-minded people?
To help you work
Sounds
it out.
it's very Protestant, and I'm not suggesting that's not a good thing, but it is quite different, I think, from a lot of thinking that perhaps some of us who are in their older years might have grown up with.
Yes, I fully agree with you. Why do people come together? People come together because to support one another, because they care for one another, they want to look out for one another, they want to help one another. All of those things, they feel comfortable with one another. And that's the role of the church, basically, is to support. The church is just people get together. Now, Constantine, way back, conscripted the church into his state apparatus, and gave it a status that, for one reason or another, they accepted. And it has, continued in various ways since then. But basically, the church is people like you and me and everybody else here just getting together to support one another. And that's the role of the organization. It gets organized, and the bias in any organization is self-preservation, so that it kind of tends to take over what's the whole show, but it shouldn't.
So,
Because the
Margaret, would
important
you
part of
mind
the
putting
show
that
is people.
that author and the book in the chat, please? If you know how to do that. Yeah.
I'll give it a go.
Thank you.
Thanks, thanks, John, and thank you, Kevin.
Yeah.
Yes, Les. Unmute yourself, please. You'll need to unmute, Les.
I've got it. I've got it.
Right.
Yeah, thank you. Earlier, Robert referred to morphic resonance or morphic fields, Rupert Sheldrake's work. And I wanted to put this to you. I wonder if you've given thought to any of these issues concerning fields around us. We talk about field theory, quantum field theory, that we are all, in fact, connected by quantum fields. The very particles that make up our atoms are all excitations or vibrations in fields that fill the universe. And it seems to me, and this is just my opinion, and it's the opinion of other people as well, that much of what we talk about in terms of being connected to one another, and this is very Eastern thinking, is to do with the fact that we are all part of a fabric of connection through quantum fields in the universe. And that this consciousness we speak of, which we think of as being our own, is in fact something universal. There's a lot of talk about panpsychism, which suggests that everything is conscious in some form. And we talk about God being the first cause of all things, and you mentioned that earlier, that we emanate or originate from one point, one being, or not a being, because God is not a being, but the ground of all being, that we all are connected because of that very origin. And through the fields of the universe, we are connected. We talk about mental telepathy. We talk about psychic events where a person who has a twin who's in a different continent has a sudden sense or intuition that their twin is in trouble or something's happened to them. And that fits in very well with the idea of there being a connection through the morphic resonance fields, whatever way you want to express it. We've got no proof of these things, but I'm wondering if you'd like to comment as to whether that's come across your awareness at any time.
Yeah, sure. And I think people like Ilya Delio and Diarmaid Amorico have a lot to say about those things.
Mm.
And I think that the quantum reality is correct. Well, it's been evidenced and people have worked on it. But I would say that quantum fields operate at a very molecular particle level, and humans have developed far more I want to say complex in some ways, but in other ways it's not more complex. Like that we have compound molecules, the basic bacteria have developed, plants, animals have come and eventually the humans have evolved out of all of that. So that along the process of evolution, I don't think we have left behind anything. That in a sense we are plants, we are animals, we are molecular beings in a sense, but we've incorporated those things into a different level. So that I agree that well, people do talk about consciousness in all kinds of things, but I would say that the kind of consciousness that humans have is different, because humans are able to reflect on one another or reflect on their own activities and so on. And the kind of thing I've talked about is a consciousness that animals don't have. Now, we're all connected because we're all made from the same stuff. And we've all evolved in that way. And so that it would be silly to think that we're not connected. But the kinds of connections vary, I guess, according to the kind of being that we are, whether we're, a plant or an animal or a human or just a quantum particle, that kind of thing. And I think I don't have the answers to all of that. And I agree with you, like there was evidence that twins fell apart, have the same sensations and so on. These are facts that haven't been explained. And that's where we need to pay attention rather than just dismiss them as something that's just not real. When talking about panpsychism, I've got an issue, mainly related to how we arrive at concepts. Concepts don't exist apart from the mind, any human mind. So that to talk about a universal concept, I think, is wrong. It's misguided. But it's quite possible for many people to have the same concept, but each time that concept arises from the individual, from the person, through their own insight. And that's what insight is about. And Lonergan wrote a huge book based on that, which he called Insight. But it's very much about the process that's actually happening when you have an insight. And that's where you create the concept. And each concept is created uniquely. Now, it quite happens that maybe 100,000 people have the same concept. They come at it the same way. But there isn't any concept existing somewhere that has to be understood or has to be grasped. We come up with it ourselves.
I think if I could comment, Liz, I'm really interested in Sheldrake's theories and continue to read about different aspects of that. I'm also really interested in David Bohm's concept of the implicate order, because I think we have different realms. We have the material realm that we're sitting in right now, but there's also other realms, I think, that we still don't understand. And when you have ESP and near-death experiences and a whole range of those other experiences that people have that can't be explained by what we understand at the moment, but we're still learning as a human species.
Could I ask you, John, then, what do you think of what I was saying about the spiritual aspect of thinking and knowing and understanding, deciding as a spiritual activity?
Yeah, look, this may be trite, but I think the beginning and end of the spiritual journey is self-understanding, and understanding that how you operate as a human being, understanding that God is part of you and that you are part of God, that you are part of the world.
In what way?
And the world is part of you. I just think that self-understanding is the fundamental building block for spirituality.
Mm-hmm. So you're happy enough with my suggestion that when you are understanding something, you're in the spiritual realm.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, because your judgment about things and your deciding is based on that understanding. Mm-hmm. So if your understanding wrong, then your judgments and your decisions are going to be wrong. Mm-hmm. Which happens to me a lot because my wife tells me I'm mostly wrong.
You're not alone, John.
It also begs the question, John, as to what your understanding of God is.
Yes.
But that's a subject for another day.
Yes. Yeah. Well, Liz has left us, but Liz Little is going to be looking at that a little, in a paper in the future. So that'll be good.
She might be opening a hornet's nest.
Yeah. Well, look, folks, it's 6:15, so it's time for me to go and have dinner with my wife and be told that I'm wrong again. Thanks very
so
much,
for
Kevin.
the
Thank you very
invitation,
much.
John, Robert.
And
Thank you, Kevin.
good night,
Bye.
everyone. Hope you have a good night and a good week.
Good night.